Just last night, I was lost in the jungle with Pitfall Harry, surrounded by giant scorpions and man-eating crocodiles.
The year was 1982. The Atari 2600 had peaked with its home console release of Pac-Man. Along with that, the 2600 also got games like Frogger, Centipede, Donkey Kong, and the system's most beloved game, E.T. the Extraterrestrial. The future looked so bright for Atari, in fact, that every video game manufacturer went blind, resulting in the almost complete destruction of the entire North American video game industry. Whoops. Hello people, I'm Tommy, and just like Atari, everyone hits their peak at some point in their lives. For example, you peaked in high school, humanity as a whole peaked on November 17th, 2003, and of course the Virtual Boy peaked in the 1 year that it existed. But what about the other systems? When did those home consoles hit their highest level of popularity before fading into irrelevancy for the rest of their miserable existence? The life of a console comes in many forms. Typically it goes from announcement to launch to about 5 to 6 years on the market to waiting for the successor system and repeat. Not all consoles are like this. Some have incredibly long lives that continue years after the initial release, while others don't even make it out of their first year on the market. But when was the best time to own these consoles during their heyday? What year had everything going for a particular system? A good console year comes from a multitude of factors: historic or pop culture importance, stupid-ass gimmicks, but most importantly are the video games released that year. An important thing to mention is that we will be looking at North American release dates. For example, The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker was released in Japan in 2002, but was released in North America in 2003, so we'll be counting it as a 2003 release for today. And of course, these choices are just my opinions, which luckily means they're fact, because every single take I have is the correct one. If you don't like my choices, you can send your complaints to this email, and I won't get back to you anytime soon. Now then, a console's best year, starting with the Nintendo Entertainment System. Easily its best year was its nationwide release in 1986. Most people first experienced Super Mario Bros. Along with the release of some of Nintendo's most beloved franchises, such as The Legend of Zelda and Metroid. But the reason for 1986 being such an important year for the NES is because it's the console that ended the video game crash that occurred in 1983, solidifying gaming as a mainstay in North America. Along with a combination of good titles and major historic importance, 1986 was the best year for the NES. Speaking of historic consoles, Sega would jump into the world of the 8-bit market with the Sega Master System. And of all consoles that have ever been released, the Master System is certainly one of them. The games exist, the graphics are present, and I can guarantee you, in the history of humanity, at least one person has owned a Sega Master System. Look, I'm from Central Jersey, where we are very anti-Sega, so forgive me for not having much to say. But I have come to the conclusion that the greatest year for the Master System is whatever Brazil thinks the best year for the Master System is, because those guys really like the Master System for some reason. But if you want my opinion, 1986, Pro Wrestler and its incredible box art came out that year. The year 1992, on the other hand, is the year of the Game Gear. Why? Well, according to my notes, it says Sonic 2 and nothing else, so congratulations to the other Sega console I haven't played. But not to worry, I have disappointed my bloodline by playing the Sega Genesis, so I actually have things to say about it. With the release of the Genesis, Sega had brought Nintendo to its knees with its 16-bit blast processing bullshit. I was really close to giving 1991 the belt for best Genesis year, due to that being the release of the original Sonic the Hedgehog, but I'll have to give it an honorable mention because 1994 was even better. Sonic 3 and Knuckles is one of the only Sonic games I've ever played, so that means it's the best one. Sega let Mortal Kombat continue down its bloody path of including blood in Mortal Kombat 2, and NBA Jam pioneered big head cheat codes in gaming, making 1994 the year of the Genesis. 94 was also very good for the Genesis's rival, the Super Nintendo. Games like Donkey Kong Country, Super Metroid, and Final Fantasy III. Which is not the same as Final Fantasy III on the DS, because Final Fantasy III on the SNES is actually Final Fantasy VI, and Final Fantasy III on the DS is the real Final Fantasy III. I'm not talking about changing titles again. Anyway, 1994 was a very good year for the SNES, but it's not the best, because for my money, that goes to 1996. By this point, the Nintendo 64 was on the horizon. Instead of sitting back and waiting for its impending fall to irrelevancy to its successor, the SNES decided to pump out some of the most memorable titles on the console. Donkey Kong Country 3, Super Mario RPG, Kirby Superstar, Super Street Fighter 2, and I know I'm talking about North America, but Japan was kicking ass too, because they got Genealogy of the Holy War, a game that I fully believe if got localized would be remembered as one of the greatest games of all time. The SNES was the gift that kept on giving, and it continued to give incredible games even into its twilight years. A console that most certainly didn't do that was the infamous Virtual Boy. This console had a lifespan of a single year, and most of its games came out in 1995. The only games anyone really ever brings up for the console, Wario Land and Jack Bros, are both 1995 titles, along with games such as Mario Clash, Telero Boxer, and Mario Tennis. Not much to say, 1995 is the one and only year for the failed boy that is the Virtual Boy. But now let's talk about the successful boy, the Game Boy. And two big years come to mind, and both are being carried by a single game. In 1986, you bought a Game Boy, you got Tetris with it. A lot of people who didn't play video games bought a Game Boy just for Tetris. A game that's easy to understand and hard to master was the perfect source of entertainment for any mom who hadn't had any fun since Woodstock. And for the longest time, Tetris was the best-selling game on the system. Until 1998. 9 years after the Game Boy's release, and one of the most impactful video games in history would be released in North America. Pokemon Red and Blue brought the Game Boy back into relevancy and made it more popular than ever before. This would kickstart the Pokemania craze, and would also be the first of many Nintendo handhelds whose best year is due in part to a Pokemon game being released. And since we've been talking a lot about Nintendo, how's our good friend Sega doing? Well, they just announced at E3 that the new console, the Sega Saturn, was releasing today, and for a pretty hefty $399. This was done in order to compete with the new console coming out by a company called Sony. So in response to this, Sony would give one of the most iconic announcements in E3 history.
Sony Computer Entertainment President of America, Steve Reyes, join me for a brief presentation. $299.
$100 less than Sega's console. The Saturn was now dead on arrival, and Sega was fucked. The best year for the Sega Saturn is non-applicable, since this console's whole life was nothing but pain and torture, and with no new mainline Sonic, there was nothing getting people to want to buy this thing. 1997 gave us Sonic Jam. It's only a compilation game, but it's still something. 1996 gave us Nights in a Dream. That's also something. And 1998 had Panzer Dragoon Saga, a game that 95% of people only care about due to the fact that it is expensive as hell. See, the challenge with the Saturn is that there are so many options because all the years are equally terrible. But Sonic Jam is still Sonic, so good job, I guess, 1997. You win the award for the best year for the Saturn. Sorry to everyone born in 1997. But now for the complete opposite of the Saturn, because this was the hardest console to figure out a best year for, because there were too many good years to choose from. The Sega killer itself, the PlayStation. For every other console on this list, I usually had either one year that was clearly dominant or two really good years to choose from. But for the PlayStation, I had to narrow it down to 3 incredibly good years. That being 1997 with games like Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Crash Bandicoot 2, and Final Fantasy VII. 1998, which gave us Tekken 3, Crash Bandicoot Warped, Spyro the Dragon, and Metal Gear Solid. And 1999, the year of Grand Theft Auto 2, Gran Turismo 2, Resident Evil 3, and Tony Hawk's Pro. Sony was serious about entering the gaming industry, and the quality that the PlayStation had every year is absolutely insane. But of the 3 best years, I'm gonna have to give it to 1998. Best Crash Bandicoot game, first Metal Gear Solid and Spyro, and even Tekken 3 I really enjoyed playing despite it coming from a genre I usually don't enjoy. As somebody who wasn't around for the PlayStation's heyday, I'm not surprised that people said screw the Saturn and jumped to this thing. Sony was able to smack talk the competition and had the best games of the time to back it up.
What have I got?
But let's say you want to wait a little longer for the next generation console experience, because you were a loyal Nintendo fan. Nintendo's jump into 3D went very well with the release of the Nintendo 64. Super Mario 64 laid the groundwork, and every other 3D platformer built off the innovations of such an impactful title. As studios began to master developing games for the system, we would arrive once again to 1998. The year we got games like Mario Party, F-Zero X, 1080 Snowboarding, and 3 console-defining titles. The beloved 3D platformer Banjo-Kazooie, the incredibly beloved Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, often considered the greatest game ever made, and my beloved South Park 64. This game sucks ass, but it's my favorite game on the console. And because of that, South Park carries 1998 into being the N64 at its peak. But looking at the handheld scene, Nintendo's Game Boy Color really doesn't have much going on. Since it has exclusive games that can only be played on the Color and not original Game Boy, it is technically its own thing, so... Wario Land 3, Donkey Kong Country, Metal Gear Solid, and since this is a Nintendo handheld, a Pokemon game has to be included, and those games are Pokemon Gold and Silver. Look, I don't mean to get political, but the Gold, Silver, Crystal era of Pokemon is kind of not that good. And the only reason people say they like the Johto games is because of a pair of remakes we'll talk about later. So because of that, Y2K gets the top spot. And with the entrance into the new millennium, we must talk about Sega's last stand with the Dreamcast. Unlike the other consoles mentioned, I have to give the Dreamcast a special case because I think the best time for the Dreamcast was from late 1999 to late 2000. The reason for this is because in North America, the Dreamcast was released in October of 1999, and Sega now only had 1 year to prove the Dreamcast was worth buying. Sony was going to release the PS2 in October of 2000, and once that behemoth comes out, it's all over for Sega. Because of that, this 12-month period gave us Sonic Adventure, Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, Resident Evil Code Veronica, Soul Calibur, and the PlayStation 2 killer, Seaman. Of all Sega's home consoles, the Dreamcast had by far the best lineup of games to come out in such a short time, but unfortunately it wouldn't be enough to save them.
Crazy Taxi!
But now we enter the era of the big 3 modern console manufacturers, and despite the GameCube not selling as well as the competition, Mr. Bronze Medal still had some great years. An honorable mention has to go to 2001. Luigi's Mansion, Pikmin, and Melee. Some of the most beloved GameCube titles came from that year. But in my very humble opinion, I have to give it to the best year in human history, 2003. We got the best platformer, SpongeBob SquarePants Battle for Bikini Bottom, the best golf game, Mario Golf Toadstool Tour, a whole bunch of racing games such as F-Zero GX, Kirby Air Ride, and Mario Kart Double Dash, and just like stated before, we'd get The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker coming from overseas. 2003 was such a good year that even the Game Boy Advance had a killer lineup. Of course, the obligatory Pokemon game that needs to be there, but also Metroid Fusion, Mario & Luigi's Superstar Saga, Super Mario Advanced 4, Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced, and the first time the Western world got to play a Fire Emblem game. 2003 was definitely a pretty good year for gaming, but that was just the calm before the storm. 2004 was a fantastic year for video games. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Star Wars Battlefront, Spider-Man 2, Red Dead Revolver. 2004 was a quality year for third parties, and with the release of the incredibly popular PlayStation 2, Sony knew they just needed killer exclusives as well. So we'd also get Ratchet & Clank, Up Your Ass, and Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. But then, from over the horizon, you hear the sounds of shooting purple needle things and the yells of alien soldiers. There's a new console competitor, Microsoft's Xbox, with Fable, Ninja Gaiden, and their ace in the hole, Halo 2. God damn. 2004 was chock full of amazing games, and due to this, the gaming industry was more competitive than ever before. And I bet you thought I would forget, but not to worry, it's time to talk about the real industry titans, the Nokia N-Gage and the motherfucking Gizmondo. 2004 for the N-Gage and 2005 for the Gizmondo. Specifically, October 22nd, 2005, because the launch of the Gizmondo was also the end of the Gizmondo. What a tragedy. Oh, but look at that. An actual handheld console, the PlayStation Portable. Not really much going on with this thing, but it had Vice City Stories and the best game on the system, Loco Roco, released in 2006. Hell yeah. And with that, the 7th console generation is here, and Nintendo finally felt the sweet smell of success once more with the Nintendo Wii. And throughout this discussion, we've talked about some pretty incredible years for gaming, but for a lot of people born in the 90s and even early 2000s, there was no year quite like 2007. For the Wii, there was a Lego Star Wars, a Mario Party 8, Metroid Prime 3, and Super Paper Mario, but they're not the reason I choose 2007, because that honor goes to the best Wii game, the best game of 2007, and the closest thing we have ever come to a flawless masterpiece of art, Super Mario Galaxy. Even if every other Wii game that came out that year was the biggest piece of schlock ever made, Galaxy was gonna carry 2007 to the top. I'm shocked that the whole debate over if video games are art survived after this incredible year of gaming, because not only did the Wii get an absolute banger, the Xbox 360 was firing at all cylinders. Call of Duty 4 brought the franchise into the mainstream, and Assassin's Creed had just released its first installment. That alone would be pretty solid, but then 2K comes in and just says, let's make one of the greatest first-person shooters of all time, and we got BioShock. That wasn't even the most anticipated game on the system, because people were losing their minds over Halo 3. Oh my god! And that's not even talking about the games coming out on the PlayStation 3, because Sony was too busy screwing up every step they took. 2007 was a magical year for gaming. The year people got to explore space with Mario, see Rapture for the first time, and totally definitely finish the fight. This single year was a treat for all gamers who got to experience it. But now we must leave that incredible time and enter 2009, because we got the real Johto games: Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Scribblenauts, GTA Chinatown Wars, Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon. Personally, I think the DS is all up to preference. 2005 gave us a bunch of casual games and Mario Kart DS. 2012 gave us the best mainline and spin-off Pokemon games, but for the sake of variety and my overwhelming Fire Emblem bias, 2009 takes it. Back to talking about failures that stink. The PlayStation Vita. Boo-hoo-hoo. A stupid console that no one likes, and it only ever had 2 games that mattered: Persona 4 Golden and Gravity Rush, both releasing in 2012. For many years, the Vita's biggest selling point was it was the only place you could play Persona 4 Golden. But now that we live in a world where the masses can experience a dachi, the reason to own a Vita continues to sink. And even Gravity Rush, a game I adore, controls like ass on the Vita. And the PlayStation 4 remaster existing means you have no reason to play on this system. But hey, we still have another Sony console that's been on rough times.
Shut up, Adachi.
By 2013, the next PlayStation was announced, and Sony were about to witness the PlayStation 3 lose to the extremely popular Xbox 360. Sony had to mangle together as many resources as possible to somehow close the gap between it and the Xbox to come out on top. With this attempt, we would see Minecraft come to the system, we would get another Gran Turismo game, and GTA 5 released. But unfortunately, these games were either available on Xbox 360, or in Gran Turismo's case, not gonna save the PS3. So, the PS3 had no choice but to accept third place. The Last of Us came out, and the PlayStation 3 outsold the 360. As somebody who was a devoted follower of the Xbox 360 at the time, it's still crazy that among all the controversies, scandals, hackings, the PlayStation 3 actually managed to beat the Xbox 360 in units sold. Perhaps it was an omen for things to come. As Sony would refocus its efforts on video games, Microsoft was about to go down a much more sinister path. But we're not there yet, so let's talk about the best console ever made, the 3DS. In the past, I've said that the launch of the 3DS was handled badly, and that's not actually true, because in reality, the launch of the 3DS was handled so incredibly poorly that the fact that this system survived its first 2 years is nothing short of a miracle. But then what felt like an eternal darkness began to fade, as light shined down on the blighted 3DS install base, and we were finally given video games. Pokemon X and Y, Donkey Kong Country Returns, A Link Between Worlds, Animal Crossing New Leaf, and of course a game I've brought up countless times in the past, the king of the 3DS library, one of my favorite games of all time, and that of course is Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon! No, I'm just fucking with ya. It's Fire Emblem Awakening. This phenomenal peak perfection of a video game is what made people give a damn about not only the 3DS, but brought back the Fire Emblem franchise from the depths of being lost forever. It saved the series, and that's why 2013 is the best year for the best console. Now, if you're bummed out that Nintendo was about to save the 3DS, don't worry, because there was no saving Nintendo's biggest modern fumble, the Wii U. The tragedy of the Wii U is an enthralling one, but to cut it short, it's Nintendo coming off of their Wii high and getting smacked back into reality. For a console that's always considered a failure, it still had a decent library of games, and midway through the console's life, Nintendo at least still cared about it because 2014 was a pretty stacked year. Coming off of the year of Luigi, we got the best-selling Wii U game, Mario Kart 8, the continuation of a very strong IP with Super Smash Bros. For Wii U, a new IP with Splatoon, and Wii Sports Club, the Wii U might have sold the worst of the 8th generation consoles, but it is far, far from the worst. Because despite what I say about any other console, there is not a single system that I despise more than the Xbox One. You can discuss the times that you made poor financial decisions, but they will never compare to anyone who was Team Xbox in the 8th generation console wars. I was one of those poor souls who fumbled that bag, and I paid the ultimate price by having to experience one of the worst consoles ever made. Still, this isn't a Sega Saturn situation. Third parties will still make good games for the system. But if I'm going off of personal experience, 2015 was the best year because that was the year we got Rare Replay and Rainbow Six Siege, the only 2 games I actually enjoyed on this waste of space. But jumping back to the Wii U, Nintendo dropped the ball so bad they needed to make the Nintendo Switch. This thing right here was the first console I ever bought with my own hard-earned 14-year-old cash back in 2017, and because of that, Nintendo really had no choice but to release system-selling level games. Breath of the Wild at launch, Mario Kart 8 going from a really good Mario Kart to the best Mario Kart, a new IP with ARMS which Nintendo quickly stopped caring about and then gave us Splatoon 2, we got Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Mario Odyssey all in a single year. This was such a magical time to be a Nintendo fan, and we may never see Nintendo in such a desperate state again. So you better cherish 2017 as the beginning of Nintendo gutting eShop music from their systems, you bastards. The PlayStation 4. It's like the Xbox One, but with games on it. Because of that, Sony was able to keep users interested in this console for a very long time, and they had a great lineup of first and third party support. This culminated in 2018 with Red Dead Redemption 2's release, but also with exclusives like God of War, Detroit Become Human, and Marvel's Spider-Man. I haven't gotten around to playing God of War or Detroit Become Human, but I did play Marvel's Spider-Man for the first time this year, and as somebody who thrives off of not caring about superhero stuff, this is one of the best games I played this year. So round of applause to Can't Sleep Games for this one, and marking 2018 as the PS4's finest 8,760 hours. The impact of these years are why I and so many other people go back to old consoles years after they're taken off of store shelves. It shows that these old games still have importance in culture to this day, and despite the outdated hardware, people still consider these pieces of technology an important part of their lives. And there we have it. But you're probably wondering about the current consoles, the PS5 and Xbox Series X's best year. Well, just like me, they peaked the day they were born, and it's all been downhill ever since.